All right, so we're going to go over some stuff that should be. We really kind of talked about a lot of it in class already about the different parts of culture, which the PowerPoint that I went over in class is not something that you find in your book, but it had a lot of the elements that are part of your book. Your book defines habit as a repetitive act performed by an individual. And I think the rule of thumb is that 21 days makes a habit, that kind of thing. And custom is the repetitive act performed by a group. All college students from the American South wear jeans with colorful patches. So it's habit is something that individual, custom is something done by a group. Okay. It also talks about in your book leisure activities. We mentioned a lot of these things, the different parts of culture. One of the things it mentions on page 109 is that a collection of social customs produces a group's material culture. Okay, for example, jeans typically represent American informality and a badge of youth. And in this chapter, custom may be used to denote a specific element of material culture, such as wearing jeans, whereas culture refers to a group's entire collection of customs. So culture is the overarching element versus custom being the individual act of wearing jeans, okay? And then habit is the individual person doing that particular thing. Let's see, what else? Let's see, what else? Oops, sorry. Okay, so it talks about folk culture versus pop culture, okay? In folk culture, they have anonymous hearths, possible to have multiple hearths, each originating independently, which comes from the actual term and thought of independent inventions. Okay, that's basically your origin of your folk culture. Okay. And how it's diffused. This is compared to pop culture. Folk culture is transmitted from one location to another more slowly and on a smaller scale, mainly because your folk culture is not. It's just not as quickly diffused. Okay, people don't get folk culture does not usually get out as much. They're not as eager to spread it, and so therefore it's not going to spread as quickly as your pop culture. It says the diffusion of American popular music worldwide began in earnest during the 1940s when the Armed Forces Radio Network broadcast music to American soldiers and to citizens of countries where American forces were stationed. That was one of the things, again, when we talk about pivotal moments, okay, and when we talk about diffusion of American music, one of those moments could be the World War II, when people in, and then, of course, think of all of the other wars in Vietnam where they had music being played over radios in Vietnam. Korea, same thing. That's one of the ways that a lot of American music was spread so quickly across the globe. Before we had such a globalized trading society as we do now, okay, or the internet as you guys would think about it, okay. And then it also says that one of the other biggest pieces is that right here where it says your product of developed countries. Well, when you think about who has the power, that's what you have to think about. Your developed countries they're using technology at a high rate. It's changing constantly. Therefore, they have the power, the ability to diffuse those ideas, to diffuse that music, to diffuse that particular kind of culture, whether it's fast food restaurants, because that's stimulus culture. You're going to have a fast food restaurant in Saudi Arabia. It's going to look a little bit differently, but it's going to be the same concept of fast food, what fast food looks like. Those diffuse so rapidly because your developed countries have that kind of power, okay? That kind of influence, which is what we would call it a sphere of influence. But that's why pop culture is usually determined by North America and European, because that's where your dominant developed countries are. And then it goes on, page 110, it says, through their choices of subjects of painting, each group reveals how its culture mirrors the religions and individual views of the group's environment. It's down at the bottom. So it's talking about the distribution. The Buddhist in the northern region, Buddhists paint idealized divine figures such as monks and saints. Some of these figures are depicted as bizarre or terrifying, perhaps reflecting the inhospitable environment. So basically what it's talking about is just the combination of local physical and cultural factors influencing the distinctive distribution of folk culture. Okay? And it goes on to explain the Hindus, the Muslims, and the animists and how they interpret things and what their artwork is. It says the Muslims, in the western portion, Muslims show the region's beautiful plants and flowers because the Muslims' faith prohibits displaying animate objects in art. Okay, so again, depending on how their religions are dictated, will depend on what kind of art they're allowed to create and to view. And then it talks about the animists from Myanmar and elsewhere in Southeast Asia who have migrated to the eastern region of the study area, paint symbols and designs that derive from their religion rather than from the local environment. Okay, so it really kind of depends on, and this is all under the tag of distribution, where popular culture is distributed widely versus your folk culture, which is not going to be as wide. Okay. And then it goes on to talk about folk culture, smaller scale, slower transmission. Pop culture tends to be transmitted by way of hierarchical diffusion. And remember that hierarchical means that the people that have access to it first, usually your elite groups, will have it first, and then it trickles down to everyone else. And it diffuses rapidly and extensively from the hearths or nodes of innovation with help of modern communication. So that's, again, the technology, and that's going to come from your more developed regions because they have access to the internet, they have more freedoms along the internet. You're not going to see some of that coming from your developing regions or underdeveloped regions that don't necessarily have freedom of speech or freedom of expression when it comes to what you can and cannot put on the internet. Okay. It also says, this is the distribution part, isolation from other cultures because of physical barriers, distance and mountain range. Again, when you're looking at the Buddhist, the Tibetan monks, people that are highly isolated, that's gonna cause a barrier for them to get their folk culture out. Okay, and then your pop culture, again, widely distributed across many countries, with little regard for physical factors. And the only principal obstacle they have for pop culture is the access, the lack of income, okay, to purchase. Okay, like you don't have the iPod because you can't afford it, or you don't have the next latest and greatest because because you either can't afford it or you choose not to, because there is that option. Okay, like my mother, she doesn't want to buy a phone, and I forced her to do it. Now she hates it. Yay me. All right, so it also talks about folk music. It originates anonymously. Let's look at what this says on page 112. Okay, according to a Chinese legend, music was invented in 2697 BC when the Emperor Yang Ti sent Ling Lun to cut bamboo, and I know I just butchered those names, so forgive me, poles, that would produce a sound matching the call of the phoenix bird. In reality, folk songs usually originate anonymously and are transmitted orally. Okay, so that's part of the oral culture. Okay. Kind of like your Southern gospel songs that many of them originated from the slave trade. Okay. And it says a song may be modified from one generation to the next as conditions change, but the content is most often derived from events in daily life that are familiar to the majority of the people. Okay, that's your folk music. All right. And then your pop music, let's see. Life cycle events. Again, folk music really kind of tells a story. Okay, not that pop music doesn't, but there's some that not necessarily. It says pop music written by specific individuals with the intent of being sold, okay, and performed in front of a paying audience. That's typically what your pop music. It doesn't mean that it doesn't tell a story. Taylor Swift is great at writing songs. Okay, doesn't mean you always have to agree with her, and if she ever gets married and doesn't have somebody to break up with, then she may not write very good songs. I don't know. But that's the kind of the point behind a lot of the songs. That they still tell a story, but they also have to be good enough to where, are people going to buy this? Okay, and that's kind of the intent behind the pop music. Okay, folk music is written because it's telling a story, and you're not really bent on having it sold. Okay, it often displays a high degree of technical skill. Okay, because it's not just sitting around playing on a guitar. There's a lot of other instruments concerned. And musicians often have strong connections with other similar musicians that may span the globe, okay? And then the last piece that it talks about is sports, okay? It talks about the origin of soccer and folk culture, and the diffusion of soccer, which is a big sport in most of in Europe, in Africa, as you guys learned from the Fugees, as if you didn't know, in Latin America, football, as we know it, is definitely not the sport around the globe. Okay, baseball or cricket is more likely to be a common sport than football as we know it. Rugby is closer to our version of football than anything else. So it also talks about the Olympic sports. To be included in the Summer Olympics, a sport must be widely practiced in at least 75 countries and on 4 continents. And it has to be 50 countries for women. Okay? The 2016 aquatics, athletics, badminton, archery, boxing lists all of them. Okay? The 2 leading team sports in the United States, American football and baseball, are not included. Again, because they're not widely practiced. All right? It's not something that everybody does. Those other sports are. Okay? And then the surviving folk sports that it talks about are cricket, which many of you have already mentioned when you do your presentation on the countries that your parents or that you came from, okay, which is a surviving pop sport from the UK. South Asia, as we mentioned before, that's why it's a big thing in India and in Pakistan. And I'm not sure about Sri Lanka, but I would guess that it is. Okay. You can prove me wrong if you would like, but I think, again, because of its proximity to South Asia, that it would be. Wushu is martial arts that combine forms such as kicking and jumping, okay, and then baseball. Once confined to North America, became popular in Japan after it was introduced by American soldiers who occupied the country after World War II. So there you have it again. World War II, gigantically, fanatically pivotal, okay? Cannot say it enough. So much happened after World War II in so many aspects of the spokes of the wheel of human geography, okay? Urbanization, population, political, agriculture, you name it, there's something pivotal that stemmed from World War II. And folk culture is, again, one of them, okay? And here's some boys playing cricket, which I have never played, actually, but would love to try. Okay. So we're going to stop there because that's the end of key issue 1.